Hello, and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 1st of August, 2022. I am joined, as ever, by my eager co-host, my actually fairly casual co-host. He's got an open neck today. He's looking chill. How are you doing,
Feeling
Andy?
anything? I'm feeling anything but chill. I don't know about up in the northeast where you are, but certainly down here, where the heat wave is about to be back with a vengeance. I think.
Yeah. 27 degrees outside, and that's quite a jump from yesterday's 19. So I think, heat is on the horizon, and we'll be coming back to that towards the end of this show, methinks. But our watching brief continues with an oncoming heat wave or not, in the shape of a show that we wanted to bring to you last week, but we had to delay due to some scheduling issues with our interviewees. In so much as we recently passed 150 days of the so-called Ukrainian war, the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. And now, at about 150 plus 12 or 13 days or thereabouts, we're in a situation where we can possibly better understand the impacts of this conflict on people, on physical heritage, but also on culture and cultural sort of intangibles, as UNESCO calls them, in terms of Ukrainian society. And initially, we spoke to, back in March, fairly early on in the conflict, Paul Barford and Alina Nowobilska, who helped us to understand what it was like in Warsaw, observing people coming into Poland, and the knowledge, the facts, and the rumours that were floating around. And we wanted to revisit them, almost to redo the interview and get a sense of where things are now, 150 days plus later. How important do you think it is to keep an eye on this, Andy?
I think anybody who studies any major news story knows that there's something called news fatigue that comes in, and you can see that just in the coverage in the daily news bulletins. The major news networks, the BBC, CNN, Sky, the others, they've more or less withdrawn their frontline correspondents from Ukraine. And it's not fair to call them a second division, but the less well-known crews are now covering the story.
Yeah.
And that's because 3 months, 6 months is a long time in a news cycle. And as you'll hear later on, we talk about issues around stories like this, the danger of stories like this becoming almost routine. It's part of the background. So I think rather than go into detail here and now, what I'll do, I'll just set up the background to our conversations with Paul and with Alina are, as of the beginning of this month, August 2022, UNESCO are reporting that during the Ukraine war, since the end of February, 10 journalists have been killed, 171 cultural sites have been damaged in ways that are yet sometimes to be determined, and for reasons which are yet sometimes to be determined. You'll hear us discuss that in the interviews. And that 2,188 educational institutions have also been damaged. That's things from the local kindergarten right up to universities. And to put the human scale of this into perspective, the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, estimate that the Ukrainians or people from Ukraine entering and moving across Europe is something like 6.3 million since the war started. Of refugees from Ukraine looking for temporary protection, temporary residency, again across Europe, it's almost 3.8 million. Just in Poland itself, and you hear us I talk about that with Alina later on. But as of the beginning of, again, this month, August, it's 1.25 million people from Ukraine have come into Poland. So that's the human scale. and the physical scale of what we're talking about. Our first conversation is with Paul Barford, who again people might know as a prolific blogger on things like antiquities trafficking and the misuse of cultural artifacts. Paul is based in Warsaw, and as you'll hear as well, had a specific family experience of trying to help refugees from Ukraine from the war. This is the conversation we recorded. Paul Barford, last time we spoke to you, it was a few days into the war in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine, and you gave us a personal point of view of how the situation was looking from Poland, and in particular from Warsaw, where you live. Then nobody knew quite what to expect. Some people thought it would be a war that would be over quickly, a blitzkrieg. Others expected it would last for weeks, if not months. We're now more than 150 days in. How is the situation in Ukraine looking to you now, from your point of view in Warsaw?
I think that everyone's very worried, aren't they, that people are going to lose interest because nothing much seems to be happening. Yes, the front, the newly established front in the east of Ukraine has more or less stabilized. They're moving forward by hundreds of meters a day, sometimes moving backwards. I'm talking about the Russians, of course. We were talking last time about the flood of refugees that were coming in, and about how many of them were coming to Warsaw. Over 2/3 of the refugees were going to urban centres, Warsaw being one of them. And today there are more Ukrainians, in fact, going back than are coming over here as refugees. A lot of them, particularly from the west of Ukraine, I think that they feel beyond it. I mean, after all, this war that we have now, in parts of it, the front line is still only a few tens of kilometers further west than it was in 2014, 2015. This war has been going on for 8 years. So it's a bit, it's not very dynamic. That's the thing at the moment. Let's hope things change. Let's hope that things change, of course, in favor of the Ukrainians. But yeah.
And when we spoke last time, you were talking particularly from your personal family point of view, that in fact one of your family members had taken in some Ukrainian refugees.
Yes. Yes.
How has that situation resolved itself in the last 150 days plus?
So there are two families of two women and their daughters. One of them is currently in the United Kingdom. She got a scholarship. She works in theatre, and she got a scholarship over there. So she's moved there with her daughter, and are doing very well, apparently. The other one was working. She was a school teacher, and she's now working as the director of a school for Ukrainian children here in Warsaw. And so she's got a job. She's moved out also, and she has a nice flat near her work, and in fact is earning more than I am at the moment, which is, I would like to say, gratifying. Yes.
And also last time we spoke, you from the point of view of Poland, there was concern about the situation on the border with Belarus.
Yes.
Before the war broke out, President Lukashenko was effectively, it was alleged, trucking refugees to the border so that they would be forced over to dislocate the Polish border and indeed further into Europe, exacerbating what's seen as a refugee crisis. Is the Belarus situation still causing concern?
It is and it isn't. It means that in the time since that started, Poland has built a wall almost along the entire of the frontier between Poland and Belarus. This, of course, is not without its own controversy, because, of course, no archaeological work was done there. And a major feature is that there are many animals that live in, it's mostly forested. And so this fence has broken the communication routes between animals, migrations, and so on. And unfortunately, these migrants are still coming. Quite interestingly, though, a lot of the ones that have been apprehended have Russian visas. They're not coming just from Belarus. They're coming through Russia now. So it seems to be part of the same kind of action. but yes, that they are still coming, and they have been coming in the summer, but not in the numbers which we saw last year, or at least that's not what we're hearing. We're not seeing on the news these crowds. So, yeah.
And turning to the cultural aspects of the war in Ukraine and the ripples that are moving out across the world effectively, but particularly obviously affecting countries with borders with Ukraine and Western Europe, the European Union. How has what's been going on affected your work patterns and the work patterns of your colleagues?
To be honest, I'm not sure that very much is going on. In that, a lot of the Ukrainian archaeologists are very busy with their own work, and of course we are helping with supplying materials where it is necessary. There was an appeal again recently for more materials for packing of objects for museums. I think probably a lot of the material that was packed very hurriedly back in February. Perhaps people are taking a new look at the way it's being stored, and there is time to do that. As I say, the general picture is of a certain amount of stagnation in most of this very large country. I'm not aware of any new programs. That doesn't mean to say there aren't any, but you probably have to talk to somebody else about that.
I was interested in your comment about the packing of museum objects and so on. There's been a fair number of articles in the mainstream media, in fact, as well as the specialist archaeological and heritage media about that, including I think a suggestion that Ukraine, although the situation in Donbass had been going on for almost well over half a decade, and the occupation of Crimea obviously happened again some years ago now, but that there was no real contingency planning, and what happened at the end of February almost caught people on the hop, and so what the initial response was largely improvised. Does that sort of tie in with what you're hearing?
Unfortunately, yes. That's actually quite difficult to explain away, how there were no contingency plans in many museums. I don't know whether we would say most museums, but many museums didn't seem to have particularly good contingency plans for this. Somebody was saying the other day that the museum did have, but it was written in the 1970s, in the Soviet era, and so pulling it off the shelves and reading it, they had to sort of read between the lines what the original intent had been. So yes, I think this is perhaps a lesson that all museums could learn from this. But on the other hand, a lot of them were able to find the material for this very quick, temporary action. Sorry, yes.
Well, I was going to say, just turning to the reporting of damage to cultural sites in UNESCO. As of the 25th of July, and I'm taking this from the UNESCO website, UNESCO has verified, and I'm quoting here, verified damage to 168 sites since the 24th of February, and it breaks it down as 73 religious sites, 13 museums, 33 historic buildings, 24 cultural buildings, and then the rest made up of monuments and libraries. Now, obviously, under the Hague Convention and other aspects of international law and international treaties to which the Russian Federation is a party, these are potentially cultural war crimes. But in your blogging, you've expressed some caution about how deliberate some of this damage might actually be. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Because it seems a little bit counterintuitive.
There's been quite a lot of effort expended trying to prove that the Russians are doing this deliberately. It's a deliberate policy. We all know the speech that Putin gave just before the invasion, saying that Ukraine is not a real nation. It doesn't, they're just like the Russians, really, which was just a really very weak excuse of his, one of his many weak excuses for the invasion. And people have tried to build on this. And I suspect there's a little bit of people seeking grants and funds and things for doing research into this. When you think about it, when you think of the extent of the devastation that just this random shelling of urban centres, basically a lot of it, is causing. I think it'd be in fact, that number of 160 buildings, given the amount of destruction that has taken place, is actually quite a low number. I'm sure there are many more which have been damaged. When you look at the actual buildings that are cited in these lists, and as you say in my blog, I have gone through it, some of these objects, they're not actually as, let's say, cultural or as historical as some of the others. Yes, there have been museums which have been burned and so on, but then some of the monuments that they are citing in these lists are not actually very old. And again, in the case of, for example, several of them where there was a chapel that probably was deliberately targeted right in the middle of a cemetery near Chernihiv. The reason for that is that this was a chapel put up to the memory of soldiers who had died fighting in Donbass, Luhansk, and so on. So very possibly there is a deliberate targeting there, but not for the reason that this is Ukrainian culture. These are the very troops that are coming into the area. And, you know, there's a chapel there celebrating the death of their colleagues, yes? So I think that it's been a little bit, I think that there's been a little bit of playing on this idea. I think the idea is that we're trying to make, some people are trying to make the Russians to be like the Nazis, because the Nazis certainly, when they came into Central Europe, particularly in Poland, they did deliberately try to destroy Polish culture. It was policy which they carried out very effectively. And I think that the idea is that they're trying to make out that the Russians are doing the same. But I suspect that this is rather stretching the limits a little bit at the moment.
I think one thing that's struck me looking at this is a lot of certainly commentary in the archaeological, certainly social media, and I'm not including people who are specialists in this particular area and in the need to build an incremental case when you're talking about this kind of internationally important question, but that people are taking a single tweet, a single photograph as evidence of not just a particular action, but also the intent. And we know from the work of groups like Bellingcat, for instance, that open source intelligence has to be used very, very carefully and has to be backed up by multiple sources, not just one on one day. Do you think that's a fair observation, that maybe some people have been too quick to engage in these particular questions? Yes,
I think that they are taking some of these facts out of context. So there was one situation where a report was published showing this so-called targeted destruction. And yet, when you looked into the actual site of these buildings that were hit, they were right in the middle of some of the most extreme fighting at the beginning of the war. It's not actually very surprising that the building was in some way damaged. That's in no way, of course, saying it's not important. And please don't get me wrong. The point is to try and make it into a deliberate act that they targeted that museum because it was a museum, and not because perhaps that somebody had put a field gun behind it and was firing at a bridge from there. The Russians, as we've seen, are actually quite notoriously bad at hitting things. That they're quite frequently missing the things that they seem to have been aiming at. We've had a number of cases of that. So again, I would urge caution in proposing that they are targeting certain things because of the same values which we attach to them. Yes.
Yeah. And as you say, that's not to suggest that cultural war crimes haven't been committed. It's just
absolutely yes.
To express some caution that we
or that they will be in the future. Yes, absolutely. I think this is something. And this is why I think that we do need to be very careful about the way we interpret the evidence. That we have to understand the phenomenon in order to combat the damage done, rather than just jumping to conclusions, making assumptions.
I mean, certainly one of the things I've found in trying to cover this story over the last, since the end of February, the last 4 or 5 months, is that it's important to look at political sources and military experts and so on to try and contextualize this.
Yes.
It's not just happening to it's not just what the Russians have done. It's how the Russian Federation armed forces fight their wars, for example.
Yes.
It's important
Absolutely.
to understand that.
Yes.
Moving on, one of the things that again, members of the Russian Federation armed forces have been accused of is cultural theft and attempts at cultural trafficking, and obviously that's a particular area of expertise for you, and you've been covering it for many years now. I was struck by, for example, the Armed Forces of Ukraine put out an image of frontline trench digging where they came across cultural artifacts, apparently ceramics, and made a point of saying that they'd been properly treated and properly recorded and safely removed and so on. The implication, of course, was contrast that that's exactly not what's happening on the other side of the hill, to use that famous phrase about warfare. What is your take on how both sides are actually treating cultural material in that context, and are you seeing any kind of uptick in the kind of material that's appearing on the markets?
Actually, not really. One thing that I think is one thing that makes it more complicated is that Ukraine in particular is one area where the archaeological heritage has for many years now been quite heavily looted for saleable collectible items, many of which we talked about this last time, many of which have been turning up on UK Western markets for some time, often under some kind of false provenance, some made up collection history. And this is still continuing. And I think, for me, this is one of the most interesting things. There's a war going on there, and yet it seems to have affected this trade. Absolutely, there's no noticeable effect. It doesn't seem to be increasing, but then it's not petering out. It's not, it's still going very strong. If you go on to online places, for example, just eBay, you can find hundreds of objects, hundreds of very nice objects. Still, as you say, fifth month of this war, that's quite disturbing. I think we talked last time about. I did spot a few things that seem to have appeared on the market, which I surmise perhaps have come in the pockets of these refugees. Some way of monetizing them so they can keep going when they get here. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. I don't see those, and those objects, those groups, quite large groups of objects have all been sold quite happily, sort of happy collectors out there. I was looking the other day at Russian websites. They don't have very much of an eBay, but they do have something called Avito, I think, Avito. And I was on there just before this. There's 81 fibulas on sale. It's very difficult to say what they are because they could be from Ukraine. They're the kinds which could be coming out of Roman period, particularly Roman period cemeteries. They're the most heavily looted kinds of site in Ukraine, but equally they could be from the southern parts of Russia. And indeed, many of the sellers are in the southwestern parts of Russia, which makes me suspect that in fact these are not soldiers. The soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine have come from much further east than the provinces of southwestern Russia. So it's difficult to say. And to be honest, I haven't really been monitoring this site before, so I couldn't say whether numbers increased or not. But yes, I mean, the material is being removed from archaeological sites in Ukraine still, and some of it is appearing on our markets and may well be appearing on the Russian ones as well.
Obviously, 168 cultural buildings. On one level, it's a little. On another level, it's a lot. But as you pointed out earlier in the interview, those buildings sit within communities who use them, care about them, share them with tourists and so on in more peaceful times. And those communities are also suffering dreadfully. Their apartment blocks are being made uninhabitable by Russian artillery strikes. people are being killed, queuing up to buy food in the shops. How do we maintain a perspective in this situation, particularly going forward, particularly as you said that this is not likely to end anytime soon?
It's something that we get involved in. I think that we're involved in both of these tragedies, aren't we? That following the news about the destruction of individual buildings or individual districts, we're somehow involving ourselves in the lives of those people. I think we can obviously never fully understand what they're actually going through, and on the other hand, you know, we've got these concerns about the cultural property. At some stage, decisions have to be made. Which of these buildings are going to be rebuilt? How are they going to be rebuilt? What are we going to do with them? What are the Ukrainians going to do with them? What does the community think should be done with them? I don't think that we're totally ignoring these aspects. Of course, it is as part of the local and the national community that these concerns are raised in the first place as to what culture's all about, isn't it?
Just on a quite narrow technical point, and you may not be able to answer this specifically, but is it possible to differentiate between material that comes from places like the occupied Crimea, like the Donbass, and places that are further west and have been and the ones that are currently being fought over?
I suppose it is in a way, because in fact the areas that are being fought over are outside the core area of Kiev and Rus. They are beyond, you know, all the really good stuff, the really nice Roman period cemeteries, the Neolithic or the Chalcolithic settlements. They're all further west. The troops haven't actually got there yet. The Russians haven't got there yet, and hopefully they won't. So yes, it is possible, and this might be part of the thing, that the material from this far eastern area of Ukraine is probably not the kind of thing which collectors are going to be after that much. In the same way as I was very keen to find material from Belarus, so, you know, to see what was happening there. But when you look at the antiquities that come from the soil of Belarus, then again, they're not, you know, some so-called stroked pottery has sort of been scratched. Somebody's got a stick and scratched it, and that's basically the peak of their culture for a lot of their prehistory and Iron Age. So again, it's specifically the western areas which are producing the material which collectors want. And let's face it, actually, to buy a metal detector, they are quite expensive. And unfortunately, a lot of these poor areas further to the east and to the south, if you look at the aerial photographs or the satellite photos, you can see enormous areas of farmland which have just gone out of use. There's obviously very deep and collective farms which have just closed down and fallen into ruin. There's obviously very deep poverty there, which of course is a reason why you would take a spade and go and dig a hole in an ancient site if you feel that there could be material there you could find, but not necessarily with a metal detector. Yeah.
And is there any evidence that you've seen so far of material that might have come from either personal collections that have been looted or from museum collections that have been looted?
You know, this is a question which has been talked about quite a lot, about the looting of museum collections, and the problem is that apart from Crimea, where there are quite a few museums, in the areas which are being fought over at the moment, there aren't that many museums that would hold the kind of material that we're talking about. There's a huge discussion about the gold, the Scythian gold from Melitopol, the museum there, which people have said has been looted and taken into Russia. I don't believe it has. I'm counting on Melitopol perhaps falling to the Ukrainians fairly soon, and we will find out maybe what happened to that particular gold. Private collections, again, I'm not sure, again, that your average soldier from, Siberia is more interested in washing machines than, those cruddy coins, in a drawer somewhere. I'm not sure that kind of thing would be recognized and reach the market. Yes, they are more interested, perhaps. Well, they have been. Again, we've not been hearing again these reports of the looting to the degree that we were in the first few weeks of the war. So, yeah.
I'm interested in just to pick up on the point you made about the alleged looting at the Melitopol Museum. Certainly in Britain, there were a number of what appeared to be quite well-sourced reports quoting individuals who were claiming to be witnesses of groups of Russian Federation soldiers and officials turning up almost with a shopping list and removing material. Are you saying we should be much more skeptical about those kind of reports?
I think we should. I think that, again, this is good. It's good. I hate to use the word propaganda, but it is, isn't it? On my blog, I've published a link, and it's probably still up. There is a video of a news report. This journalist goes in and talks to the new director of the museum, the ones appointed by the Russians, who is showing the material they have saved. When you look at it, it's a local museum, and these pieces of gold, it's only the small parts that were not taken to Kiev. The majority of the material from that burial is in Kiev and is safe. This was just a local museum, so they've got Soviet medals, Soviet period medals, a really mixed collection of weapons, going up to the Second World War, including material that looks as if it was found with a metal detector, and sort of, stuffed animals and this kind of thing. And that material is shown in the report after Melitopol fell. It's still there because they hid it in the basement. The curators hid it in the basement. They couldn't arrange to take it away. And the new museum staff has made a big thing about, oh, look, we're counting it, we're inventorying it, theoretically, I presume that the idea is eventually to put it back on display if it's not already on display now. The museum has a website, and the museum website says that the museum's open. I don't know how true that actually is. But you could imagine that the invader might well want to do that. They might well want to sort of, reopen the museum, show that life is continuing as normal, and of course, the fact that, as I say, a lot of this collection was connected with the Soviet period, Soviet medals, weapons connected with the taking of this area in the Second World War. It could again stress the link with the Red Army, with Russia, and so on. So you could imagine that there would be an incentive to do that. And the idea that it was taken away and taken to Russia, I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it is in any way substantiated. But we will see. We will see if that gold is there when the museum returns to Ukraine, hopefully.
So basically what you're saying is that we should maintain a healthy skepticism about what both sides say in the current conflict. Yes,
which I think is understandable, yes. It's understandable if you're on one side, you want to present what's happening. Of course, there's also this issue that it has been time and time proven that these cultural issues are things which do interest people in the West. This was the same in the Egyptian revolution. The looting of the museum was done primarily to get people in the West to be horrified at this revolution going on, which in fact it worked. Yes, and so I think that there is this tendency to use cultural crime, as it were, as a sort of a stimulus to, and of course we know that they wanted help, they wanted weapons, and so on. And I think that this story should be seen in the context of that, or these stories. Yes, a lot of them, when they're first reported, they're very alarmist, and it sounds like a huge catastrophe has happened. But then after a few weeks, it turns out that the paintings have been taken out before the museum burnt down, and things like this. Yes. But again, how do we know that story is true? Yes. what concerns me particularly is that a lot of this is being done without any real input of Ukrainians. So, I mentioned this report that had shown something had happened. And in the acknowledgements, there was not a single Ukrainian mentioned. And the fact that there's also online is a Ukrainian website which details all of this material plus more, which was not even cited in the US report. I think this is a bit disturbing that the Ukrainians are being cut out of this story. That we try to say, well, we in the West, we know best, and we're concerned, and of course the Ukrainians are concerned as well, and yet why are they not figured in these reports? Why do the UK newspapers interview somebody from the United States talking about this cultural destruction and not somebody from Kiev? Yeah,
and it's not as if a lot of Ukrainians don't speak good English, and interpreters are available. So absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's a very pertinent question. I think perhaps to finish on, I suspect we're going to be talking to you again in future, Paul, because I suspect again this is a story that is unfortunately, sadly, going to be running for some time yet.
Yes.
But thank you for joining the watching brief.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Now, if I'm honest, I should like to say what I said to you after we finished recording that. In some ways, I'll say it to you again this time with one or two other people listening in, and that is that there is part of me that is the word isn't disappointed, but rather that is underwhelmed by the lack of solid ground here. I get a little bit frustrated, I suppose, and it's not as though I want to hear about great, horrible, scandalous destruction of cultural artifacts, but the fact that we simply cannot be more precise about this stuff, probably until this conflict is over, and then independent people can go in and observe things, does lead to this almost depressing workaday reality, doesn't it? And I imagine this is exactly what I mean. You were talking about news fatigue setting in, but also life has to go on, and I think that's definitely a picture that we were getting from Paul there, wasn't it?
I think so, and I think it's worth remembering at this point as well. It's not that long ago that the Russian Federation was in its media presentation, for want of a better word, some people might say propaganda, but was presenting itself as the liberator of Palmyra in Syria from Islamic State. Islamic State having blown up several of the monuments on the World Heritage Site at Palmyra. So this stuff is complicated. There are many vested interests, not just there's not just two sides in this.
No.
And the way it's handled by media organizations varies immensely as well. The expertise that can be deployed, the assumptions that are made, the depth of the research or not that goes into a news report, all of those things have to be weighed up. And we're living now, of course, in an era of what's called OSINT, open source intelligence, with groups like Bellingcat, but also groups working on cultural crime, who are using social media, the various, everything from TikTok and Facebook to the local social media sites. Telegram, for example, is used a lot in Russia, apparently. But it takes a lot of work to do that, to assess OSINT, open source intelligence, effectively and correctly, and even then there's still elements of speculation. So we're not going to know more clearly what's been going on probably for months, if not years.
Yeah. A watching brief is a formal program of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you. That said, though, the effort has already begun to record this stuff, and often, as we're about to hear, in the context of an awareness of how similar events have unfolded in this part of the world in the past. And with that in mind, we did speak to Alina, and she is a historian working at
the Pilecki Institute.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, I should explain for people at home. We have a running joke. Whenever we talk to her, we have to sort of double check how it's pronounced, because invariably we get it wrong. So there you go. Well done, Andy. I'm sure you get a gold star.
If Alina's watching this, I'm sure she'll give me marks out of 10. No, we spoke to Alina. Alina is a staff historian at the Pilecki Institute, which is a research institute that was set up by the Polish Parliament in 2017. It has a specific remit to research and preserve memory and documentation regarding particularly the experience of Polish citizens, but in against the background of totalitarianism in the 20th century. So primarily Polish experience under the Nazi occupation from 1939 to 1945, and then later the period of communist rule.
Yeah.
So that's her point of view, and as you'll hear, she is robust in explaining it.
Forthright.
Alina Nowobilska, thank you for joining us again on the Watching Brief from Warsaw. Last time we spoke, we were not long into the war in Ukraine, and Western Europe, and Poland in particular, was in the middle of probably the greatest refugee crisis that it's faced since World War II. Now, the UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees, has published figures, the most up-to-date figures show that something like 5.1 million Ukrainians, or 5.1 million people, one should say, because there are other nationalities involved. 5.1 million Ukraine refugees from Ukraine crossed the border since the end of February, of whom 1.25 million have stayed in Poland. How do those figures translate to your experience on the streets in Warsaw where you're working?
I've got to tell you, at 1.2, was it 1.25 you said? 1.25 seems like quite a low number, actually. Things in Poland are very different. A lot of people have been asking me recently, so what is it like, to live with all of this? Well, I'm going to be honest with you guys. More cars on the road, very easy. More people on the streets, simple. But the one thing that is causing problems is things like living availability. So the availability of flats and houses and things like that. And it's not down to the refugees. It's not their fault. They're fleeing war. It is what it is. But it's causing a problem amongst normal people, or even people coming in from America or England, or, whoever wants to emigrate and live in Warsaw. They're really struggling with finding property. So that is causing a massive problem in Poland. And obviously we know things like petrol prices are going up, food prices are going up. Also, that's not necessarily just to do with the war. We just got over COVID and other things are happening. But life in Poland, like pretty much most of Europe, it is not ideologically perfect as we all like it to be.
So just in terms of day-to-day life, then presumably property prices, rentals and so on in Warsaw are now more expensive than they were as well.
Oh, God, yes. Fortunately, I've got to say I don't rent. I was going to rent, and actually my mother, for some strange random reason, said to me before I moved to Warsaw, just put the money in and just buy. It would just be so much easier. So thanks to my mother, I've got to say I'm very lucky and I'm in a very good position. But unfortunately, I've had friends who've lost their properties, or landlords have decided to put the money, and prices have gone up. Things like czynsz, which is, for example, it includes gas, it includes water, and it includes God, I've lost the word in English now, the day-to-day sort of maintenance of the property, things like that. That's gone up. Again, like I said, living costs, electricity has gone up, but it's pretty much the same as it was in every country, especially in England.
Now, when we spoke to you before, it was only a short period into the Putin's war in Ukraine, and you told us that you and your co-workers at the Pilecki Institute, if I get it right?
Yeah, Pilecki Institute, well done.
Thank you. At the Institute, you were told by your boss to basically drop any projects that weren't absolutely essential and to concentrate on Ukraine work, Ukraine-related work. Is that still the case? And if so, what kind of things have you been working on?
So me, not so much. I've kind of gone back to my own projects because they need Ukrainian speakers, and I'm not quite the right Ukrainian person. I was playing with the kids and working on that, but that's not what I should really be paid for. Agile historian, go and do some work. But my colleagues have been doing some fantastic work. They've been sending volunteers into the field. They've been speaking with people who have, experienced a lot of war, a little bit of war, people who have undergone serious crimes, people who have witnessed serious crimes, and they've tried to document everything. I spent actually the past week working with a soldier who was on the front line, and he sat down and spoke to us on camera very openly. He was very easy to talk about what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, and things like that. And we're hoping to try and get in touch with many more British speaking or English speaking people, even if they're, for example, Austrian and they speak English, or I don't know, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, any other language that speaks English. Try and get as many testimonies down in English, because predominantly they're all in Ukrainian or in Russian at the moment.
And just be clear for the audience, the Institute, amongst other things, studies war crimes and collects evidence and creates programs exploring those kind of issues. So presumably you're dealing with something that's actually very live at the moment rather than something historical, which is what you're more used to dealing with.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got a great website if anybody wants to go and check it out. It's called the Chronicles of Terror. It's also available in English. Not every single document is translated from Polish to English, but it documents all the things that happened post-war, all the testimonies that were taken, and all the statements that people stated. I mean, at the moment, what's happening in Poland is we're going over the commemorations for the Warsaw Uprising. Today, while we're recording, is the commemoration of the Wola massacre. And there's a lot. I mean, that's where the Chronicles of Terror started from. They started from the testimonies of the Wola massacre. And a lot of these are so in-depth things that they talk about literally them throwing grenades into the rooms of hospital, sick hospital and wounded people, and murdering, for example, hospital personnel, doctors, surgeons, nurses, undergoing war crimes, for example, rape. Rape was used a lot during the Warsaw Uprising, and it wasn't used by the Germans, it was used by the foreign brigades, which you've mentioned before. So, for example, the Rona and the Derlewanga brigades, who had no issue raping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 women in a row and desecrating their bodies and murdering them left, right, and centre. And I know what you're going to throw into here. This is what we're saying in Ukraine right now, too.
I was going to say, I mean, most recently, we've seen the controversy over what happened to the prison facility at Olenivka, where it appears that over 50 Ukrainian POWs were killed in circumstances which are contested. In one version, it was a Ukrainian attack. In another version, it was the Wagner Brigade, that private army that Putin has employed across Syria and in Africa to enforce Russian foreign policy, setting up the incident partly as black propaganda and partly allegedly because they were about to be exposed for massive corruption involving the money that was supposed to be spent on the facility and the prisoners. This all sounds horribly familiar to anyone that's looked at war crimes really from World War II onwards. It must be quite depressing to be faced with something like that in 2022.
Well, it's true. I mean, for example, the Russians never faced their crimes they never faced anything for cutting. They didn't face for riding through Poland and Belarus and Ukraine and Lithuania and Latvia. They never paid for any of those crimes of raping women, of looting. They severely looted everywhere they went. They were like a plague. You could imagine a plague of locusts that comes into a field and completely demolishes everything. That's what the Soviet army, the Russian army, was exactly like that. And along the way, they'd rape and murder a load of women on top of that. And nobody stood trial for any of this. Nobody even stood trial for what happened in the Warsaw Uprising. And we've actually got an exhibition now in the Warsaw Uprising Museum that talks about Rainer Farth and why he didn't stand trial for what he did. I mean, the man basically ordered the mass murder of men, women, and children, and innocent people. And nobody stood trial for this. Wanda Bagzalewski, the man who basically was the commander of the army for the Warsaw Uprising to squash it, he didn't stand trial. Nobody has stood trial. So when it comes down to Eastern European crimes, or Central, because Poland is Central Europe, Central Eastern European crimes, very few people have stood trial. Yes, you've had your odd capo and your big, person, like, for example, Hus, who was the commander of Auschwitz. You had your high profile cases. But the people who actually did the killing, where was Derlewanga? Well, Derlewanga was killed. Kamiński was also killed. He was killed by the Russians, the Germans, sorry, oddly enough. But where about Rainer Farth? Do you know he actually ended up being a mayor of a German town post-war? Can you imagine that? A man who ordered the murder of literally 180,000 people decides to be a mayor at the end of the war. Where's justice? Where's justice for Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and Belarus? Sorry,
it's interesting. No, look, I mean, we're obviously dealing with deeply ingrained, deeply sensitive, deeply frustrating, upsetting history here. It's the kind of history that we have to deal with, but we have to be very careful how we deal with it. And with those precedents, and obviously, again, in Poland, there is the precedent of the Katyn massacre in 1940, when the then Soviet regime under Joseph Stalin murdered a large proportion of the Polish intelligentsia, with the idea of basically rendering the Polish national identity unviable and the Polish state unviable post-war. Faced with those precedents and the fact that nobody, as you say, stood trial for them, some people cynically might say it's victor's justice. Others would say it's realpolitik. But as you're in the middle of a collection, you're talking to people who've been on the front line in Ukraine, who've seen what they've seen, are reporting what they're reporting. Do you, sometime in your heart of hearts, do you think this is actually a futile exercise, because the war will end at some point and this will just go into an archive?
It's quite a difficult question to answer. How long is the war going to last is one question. I hope only a few more months. What is going to be the result of this war ending? God only knows what's going to happen with that too. Will Ukraine concede some land? That's literally like saying to Britain, well, give away Scotland and Wales, see how you go. Or, for example, if we got your American citizens, I don't know, hand over New York to the Canadians or something, It's difficult. I think all of this is going to end up in an archive, but I have a very dark feeling that nobody's going to be brought to trial for this. They're just going to let it go, because Russia is such a big superpower at the moment. It still is. I mean, look at its sanctions, and it's still managing to still function. Countries are still supporting Russia on the secret, on the sly. Things are happening in Serbia, in Kosovo, in China. I don't know how this is going to end. I'm not a poli-sci expert, but we'll see how it goes.
It's interesting you say Russia's still a superpower, because certainly there's a school of thought among some commentators, certainly in the Twitter sphere, political scientists and so on, military experts, military historians, who are arguing that what we're seeing is the fact that really throughout the Cold War and up until now, Russia has effectively been cosplaying a superpower. But when asked to actually deliver, the system is so incompetently run and so corruptly run that it can't actually deliver results in the field where it's supposed to be overwhelming. And to the extent that we're now seeing almost a repeat of the attritional battles of World War One, where there's massive loss of life and massive use of high explosive to gain a few hundred meters. It seems like a very odd juxtaposition.
Do you know, everybody's got their own opinion. I think mine, I'm going to still state that Russia is still pushing, and it's still going to push, and it's going to survive. I mean, however much we'd like to partition Russia, no, it's got its own plans to partition the whole of Europe. I did see that map. It was ridiculous. Poland's only absolutely tiny. We give half our land to Russia, half our land to Germany. It's going back to the old pre-partition days. However much, like I said, I'd love to see Russia partitioned. It doesn't deserve to be what it is. Is it still a superpower? Some say yes and some say no. I stick on the yes side.
And perhaps the last question, again, it might be a slightly unfair one, but you're obviously incredibly impassioned about this story and where this current story of Ukraine fits into the story of Eastern Europe, into the story of Poland since World War II. How would you respond if people said that you should be more objective, that academics shouldn't get behind particular viewpoints like this?
I should be more objective. I know you're not saying it, but whoever the ridiculous person is that's telling me I should be more objective is a bit of a... I'm trying to use a very politically correct terminology here. I want to call them an idiot, or tell them to literally jog on, because, like I've said this before, we discussed this in the previous episode, where Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, we've been standing up on a podium and screaming and shouting for so long. There is going to be a problem. I mean, look at what happened in Belarus last year, or even the early part of this year, where we were still having refugees being pushed through the borders. Things like that were happening, but the West just didn't. Oh, it's those racist Poles and those racist Lithuanians and Latvians and Eastern Europeans. They didn't realize what was more to come. Things were coming, things were happening, and we were shouting and saying, oh, you Russophobes. That was the answer. You're just a bunch of Russophobes. Well, now look what's happened. If we'd have taken actions sooner, if somebody had listened to any of the countries that had experienced communism before and understood the rule of Russia, we would not be in this situation. And no, I should not be more objective. We were right at the beginning, we're right now, and we will be right again in the future, because the West still does not understand history. The West has never experienced... Actually, I'm going to ask, when was the last time Britain was occupied?
Well, one could argue that it hasn't been occupied by well, there was a change of government and a foreign ruler came in 1689, the Glorious Revolution, and William of Orange.
There you go, 1689. What about America?
Well, it kicked out the colonial power in 1776, didn't it? So yeah,
exactly.
I
the
get
last
the point.
time, but this is the point.
I mean, one of the reasons I asked the question was that in the last few days, certainly there's been a point of view on the left of British politics, which has argued that supporting Ukraine and sending arms to Ukraine is only extending the war, and Britain should be more involved in creating a peace process. Now, that has been responded to by others who have said, well, look, if we took that view in 1936, there would have been no international brigade and nobody would have supported the Spanish Republic, which is one of the totems of the left. And in fact, many Poles went and fought in the international brigade, or brigades. So obviously, this is a controversial issue. Do you think in the end, though, we should learn from history, or we should just observe the history that's going on around us and respond to it as human beings?
God, we should be learning from history, but nobody listens and learns from history. I mean, look how many times, I know the usual thing, history has been repeated, but look at what's happening now. For example, look what happened in the Warsaw Uprising and the devastation. If you look at photographs of Mariupol to photographs of Warsaw in 1945, it's practically identical. But nobody's learning
It's
the difference.
interesting. It's interesting as well. I noticed that during the siege of the Azov steelworks, all the analogies were with Stalingrad, and the irony that, in a sense, the Russian Federation troops involved in that action were in the role that the Germans were in Stalingrad in 1943, 42, 43. There wasn't the sense, though, you mentioned the Warsaw Uprising, which is actually perhaps a more accurate analogy, if you're going to make analogies. No analogies are perfect, but there you had a relatively small, relatively poorly resourced group of people holding out against a much stronger enemy for a substantial period of time, and much longer than people thought they could.
Well, this is the thing, speaking to people who have been on the front line, and I'm not talking about the foreign legions, because there are other people that have been straight on that front line that have been outside of these organizations. These people have told me that literally the Ukrainians were fighting like barbarians, actual barbarians. They had no equipment. They were fighting in t-shirts and shorts, couldn't shoot. The Ukrainians didn't have an army that was as well equipped as it should be. And now what's happening? Britain, America, Poland, some could say maybe Germany. Sorry, that was a slight dig, because they're not doing anything, still sitting on their hands. These countries are trying to finally push and bring things like vests and helmets and night vision and equipment. And organizations like Ripley's Heroes are doing the exact same thing. They're trying to bring all of this equipment that is needed on the front lines, training the soldiers, training them to do the basic things like shoot or to defend themselves or protect themselves, how to take out tanks, how to fight at night, how to fight in the cold, how to fight in the literally in the heat, because we've all been having heat waves across Europe. It's very interesting looking at that, because the Poles at the same time in the Warsaw Uprising themselves were not equipped. They were not taught to fight. Some of them were schooled during the occupation period, but not all of them were. Half of them were a bunch of boys who grabbed themselves a rifle and decided they were going to fight. I mean, the uprising was supposed to last a few days, same as the Ukrainian war. Putin was like, yeah, we're going to be in there like, 5, 6, 7 days a week, we're going to conquer it that quick. And also, I've also been informed the Russians are not as well equipped. The Russians are fighting beyond their means. So, yeah, it's a bit difficult with this. It's a good analogy because it's true, but then there's other analogies that I just don't like. The Warsaw Uprising one, I'll take that one, but I won't take ones where you're comparing Putin to Hitler or Putin to Stalin, because those are individuals that were in a completely different time. Putin is Putin. Putin is himself. He's going to put himself in the history book. He will be there, just like Stalin has his own place, just like Hitler has his own place.
Just drawing this conversation to a close now. Last time we spoke, I asked you what advice you had for people, historians, archaeologists watching this from not from the front line or just immediately behind the front line as you are in Poland, but and you told me, above all, check your sources. Check the sources of what you're reading, the information you're getting. Would your advice change now? And how do you see, what's your hunch about the way things might play out over the next 4, 5, 6 months into the winter?
You just use that key word of winter. I'm actually terrified with the winter. Are people going to be able to fight? Are they going to be able to learn to take care of themselves? How many deaths are we going to see because of people freezing to death? Again, you know, the analogies are going to come out of the Winter War. That's going to come out. Stalingrad, it's all going to come out. I'm worried it is going to go into winter, and I'm worried too many people are going to die. Let's hope things are resolved. Here's hoping, here's thinking, wishing. I don't know. But moving on to the advice, advice wouldn't change. Please double check your sources. Again, there is so much stuff coming out about Ukraine, so much propaganda, so many people left, right, and historical propaganda is also coming out. There's a lot of historical propaganda coming out against Ukraine, but also there's stuff coming out from the side of Ukraine. And it's really pissing off the Poles, actually. But that's a whole other different conversation because we don't have that much time to talk about it. Yeah, please, either if you're Ukrainian or non-Ukrainian or Polish, please, please, please check your sources and don't use history as propaganda. That's just a cheap shot. That's my advice.
Alina Nowobilska, thank you very much for talking to Watching Brief again.
Thank you so much.
And that is the inimitable Alina. Truly a remarkable personality and absolutely sweltering. I mean, I think she said it was 35 degrees at that point when she was recording. So very much thank you for her time in that yes. Very warm office. But as you say, undoubtedly she comes at this with a perspective, with an opinion, and with a focus that at times can be a little bit hard for people to necessarily fully understand. I mean, for my part, for example, I see the cultural well, as you were saying, the mandate of the Institute as being one that is making it's definitely a subjective perspective on history, as opposed to trying to find perhaps a completely artificial objective notion as to how history unfolded. But at the same time, if people people need to be doing this work now, don't they? Need to be actually getting a sense of who's doing what where, and even frankly what people are saying about what's happening, stuff that may simply be might eventually be thought of as being rumor, but nonetheless adds to the flavor of events that are unfolding.
I think so. I mean, I think having the perspective of somebody like Alina is valuable because I think sometimes sitting here, and she alluded to it, in a country like Britain, which hasn't been invaded or occupied, and certainly wasn't occupied or had a government that was beholden to a totalitarian state as recently as
within my lifetime, yeah.
But it's certainly within mine. I was saying to you earlier, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, I was 28. Yeah, if I'd been a Pole, I would have grown up under a communist government and at risk from invasion by Soviet tanks if that government stepped out of line with the Soviet doctrine within the Warsaw Pact. As happened with Czechoslovakia in 1968, again within my lifetime. So I think we have to be very careful to include that check and balance when we're looking at the way organizations like Pilecki work. I think the other thing I found fascinating about what Alina was saying was that it's the fact that what they are now doing is the real-time recording of people's experiences, which will go into the archive of first-hand experience. It's as though it's a bit like the mass observation that happened in Britain during World War II. That the history is being written while the history is still being made. And so it's doubly important and fascinating. And as I said to her, it's possibly also rather depressing. First of all, that we're here all over again in Europe when we thought we'd learnt the lessons. And as she was the first to point out, the experience of the Second World War and then later war crimes is that very often, for lots of different reasons, the perpetrators don't get brought to justice, and the families of the people who have been victims don't get any kind of justice or closure.
No, but at the same time, good historiography and recording means that eventually, in the long durée, in the long story of this stuff, we do know who is at fault, and we do know how things unfolded.
Indeed.
I suppose I would just briefly just say is that I definitely wasn't remotely apologising for her perspective and tone. You know, she is a historian in her own right, and you know, can speak for herself. But it was more just a case of I feel as though it's worthwhile acknowledging that it can sometimes be a bit jarring to hear a historian speaking with such a firm opinion. But also at the same time, it's one that's necessary. It's going to be one of the voices which, or these are going to be the voices that are contributing to our understanding of what's unfolding. Speaking of what's unfolding, we alluded to this at the beginning of the show. It is rather warm today. You may have just heard a fly buzz past the microphone. I don't know. It's that they're hiding from the sun outside. But I just wanted to highlight that earlier this summer, obviously we reported on and we had a heat wave that affected archaeologists in the field, and I think in the coming days, next couple of weeks, we're set to have another. And you wanted just to well, first of all, we both just want to say to people, be careful if you're working in the field. But also, Andy, you just wanted to encourage people to reach out if they want to.
That's right. After the last heat wave a few weeks back, we received reports, as did other groups, organisations, that some archaeological employees, and at least one that was named to us, had not made proper preparations to keep its field crews safe by supplying water and appropriate conditions, and even considering pulling them off site, and had even threatened people who were making complaints about that with consequences. Now, we weren't able to follow it up because basically it was hearsay. Now, all I would say is, as to echo your comments, first of all, be safe. We'll link to the St John's Ambulance and NHS advice and also the prospect archaeology advice for working in heat and your rights as workers. But as with any other story about archaeology, if you think that people who should know better are behaving badly, are behaving in a way that's dangerous, are behaving in a way that needs to be discussed openly in the public interest, please contact us. You can do it in confidence, and we'll discuss how we can bring your story into the public domain safely. Because in the end, if people in archaeology are behaving badly, potentially all of us are affected.
Absolutely. Well, on that bright note, I guess we'll bring this watching brief to a close. Thank you, as ever, Andy, for your time. Thank you, people at home, for watching and listening. And please do feel free to comment below. Please do reach out if you have any stories or ideas that you want to suggest that we pursue on the watching brief. And crucially, until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.